Our subject is impossibly broad, and any reflection on a century of Christian-Muslim relations is bound to be a very personal one. I therefore need to begin by telling parts of my own story in order to explain the particular perspective that I bring to our discussion this evening. I was born in India as a child of the Raj and came to the UK at the age of 6. I hasten to add that my father was not a missionary, but worked with the Indian police. I hoped some of you watched Jeremy Paxman last night. This means that I have had to wrestle with all the ambiguities of empire and think I can appreciate why Abdullah Sahin in a recent article speaks about the realities of an unresolved post-colonial trauma. Living and working for 18 years in 4 different spells in the Middle East, mostly in Egypt and Lebanon, has encouraged me to try to enter into the experience of Middle Eastern Christians who have lived under Islamic rule in one form or another for 1400 years. In 5 years of teaching at the Near East School of Theology in Beirut, Lebanon, my students came from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the West Bank, and from Armenia, Iran, and the Sudan. Many of these students had not had good experiences of Islam, and this was the last subject that they wanted to study in a theological college. This experience of Middle Eastern Christians was vividly summed up for me by a Christian student at Bethlehem Bible College last December who said in class, speaking about the feelings of her community towards Muslims and Islam, "Nahna majruhin," we are wounded. So my first reflection, it's hard to separate religion and politics. This is where we need to see the last century in the context of 14 centuries of Christian-Muslim relations. Christian history began with the crucifixion and the catacombs, but has included Armenia, Byzantium, and Christendom. So however hard Western Protestants today want to separate church and state, the Constantinian model is part of our history. In Islamic history, an indissoluble link between religion and politics was introduced with the Hijra and the creation of the first Islamic state in Medina, in which, as has been said, Muhammad became his own Constantine. So if we ask why so many Muslims seem to be politically motivated and why many are insistent on the principle of deen wa dawla, religion and state, part of the answer must lie in the very origins of Islam, with Muhammad being both prophet and statesman. It's hard to escape the conclusion that one basic instinct in the minds of most Muslims is that, in the words of Kenneth Craig, Islam must rule. Or in the words of Sayyid Qutb, لَبُدَّ لِلْإِسْلَامِ أَنْ يَحْكُمْ, translated as inevitably Islam shall rule. Western colonialism was such a bitter pill for Muslims to swallow, partly because it represented a great reversal. After 10 centuries in which Muslims had been ruling over Christians throughout the Middle East and North Africa, Christians were now ruling over Muslims. One of the big dilemmas for Christians today is how we should think about the conversion of Constantine and the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Was it an inevitable development after 3 centuries of minority status and persecution? Or was it the greatest disaster in Christian history because the followers of the crucified Savior were now taking up the sword to establish their faith? What we are dealing with here is how the two faiths have tried to deal with the relationship between truth and power, between religion and state. And no reflection on Christian-Muslim relations can ever be primarily or mainly about theology. We are no longer living in a world divided between Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, between Christendom and Muslim empires. We're living in a world of nation-states in which every person is a citizen with equal rights, and where there is such a thing as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But as long as Christians and Muslims have different ideas about the ideal relationship between religion and state, and how the kingly rule of God is to be worked out in a particular society, there are bound to be tensions which are related to the numbers and power of the different communities. Many of the recent conflicts in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia have their roots in political decisions made by Western powers. In this context, the rise of Islamism can be seen as a response both to Western imperialism and to the marginalization of Islam in the new Muslim states. One of the most significant events of the last century was, of course, the creation of the Islamic Republic in Iran in 1979. It's uncomfortable for Westerners to be reminded that a coup engineered by the CIA and the MI6 removed the first democratically elected leader in Persia, Mossadegh, in 1953. This led to the return of the Shah, and his dictatorial rule was followed by the return of Ayatollah Khomeini. Western powers have an enormous responsibility for creating and continue to contribute to many of the problems of the region, and that in many situations it's important to move from an apologetic approach to a more dialogical one. In saying this, I have to reckon with the fact that many Christians are still very uneasy about the word dialogue because they associate it with liberalism and pluralism and suspect that it means compromise, the lowest common denominator, and the avoidance of hard issues. I am therefore constantly encouraging Christians, especially evangelical Christians, to embrace the word dialogue and to practice it with enthusiasm. In many contexts, dialogue has hardly begun. When I arranged last December to take my class of 8 students in Bethlehem to visit the Imam of the mosque, which is less than 5 minutes' walk from the college, several were very uneasy about the idea. They eventually agreed, and we had a very good meeting over tea in the Imam's home. One of the class on another occasion was sitting in a coffee shop. Her young daughter asked her why some of the other girls in the shop were wearing the hijab. She encouraged her daughter to go and ask the girls herself. But when she felt too shy to do so, the mother took her daughter and went to talk to the girls. Her comment later in class was that before taking our course in the college, she would never have wanted or had the courage to take the initiative to talk to the girls. In both communities all around the world, we are dealing with ignorance, fear, arrogance, and prejudice, all of which are the legacy of 1400 years of difficult relationships. While we rejoice over initiatives like this center, I suspect that many of us feel frustrated that in so many contexts the ice hasn't been broken. And even in situations where there are genuine relationships and a degree of trust, we've hardly begun to get beyond the initial stages and enter into a deeper meeting of hearts and minds. If discussion about past history is to be profitable, it needs to be as well informed as possible, and both sides need to be willing to listen to each other's interpretation of the same history, however different and painful it may seem. While resisting the desire to score points over the other side, we want to be able as far as possible to speak the truth in love. What we are trying to do is to see how history affects the way Muslims and Christians think about each other at the present time, in the hope that we can understand each other better and trust each other more. Who is going to win the battle for the soul of Islam? This is the expression used by John Esposito to describe the struggle within the worldwide Muslim community between those who tend to be more moderate and open in their approach and those who want to be more confrontational. You'll notice that I hesitate to use the word extremist because it's such a loaded word. Both groups appeal to principles of Quranic interpretation which have been widely used throughout the centuries by Muslim scholars. The first principle emphasizes the importance of understanding the original contexts in the life of the Prophet in which revelations were given, known as the Asbab an-Nuzul. The relevance of and application of a particular Quranic verse for Muslims today, therefore, can be determined by the similarity between the original context of the revelation and the situation that Muslims find themselves in today. So, for example, if Muslims in the West feel that they are in a totally different situation from that of the Muslim community in Medina, they would argue that verses commanding warfare are not relevant to them today. On the other hand, Muslims in other countries who do feel that they are under attack from the non-Muslim world, as much as the Medinan Muslims were, could easily feel that the warlike verses do apply to them today. The second principle of interpretation, abrogation, suggests that some earlier revelations can be abrogated or cancelled out by later revelations. Many Islamists would argue that the earlier Quranic revelation, in which the Prophet is urged to endure opposition patiently, are cancelled out by later revelations which allow or command the use of force. This is therefore used by some Islamists to provide scriptural justification for violent confrontation in similar situations today. Esposito's battle for the soul of Islam draws attention to the intensity of this particular tension within the world of Islam, and the world is eager to know which of the two sides is going to prevail. It will be interesting, for example, to watch how the power struggle develops in Egypt between the Muslim Brotherhood, who appear to be relatively moderate in their Islamism, and the Salafis, who have been taking a much stronger approach. Some Christians today have no hesitation in quoting a medieval Islamic text and asserting that this represents orthodox Islamic teaching which is accepted as authoritative by Muslims. If they accept that Christians can change the way they express their beliefs, they find it harder to accept that Muslims can change their ideas, and find it easier to cope with a static and monolithic Islam. Many Muslims today are calling for a new ijtihad, a new process of legal reasoning which goes back to the two main sources to work out new rulings that are appropriate for modern context. Tariq Ramadan, for example, in one of his earlier books, To Be a European Muslim, explained in some detail the process by which he works out new, genuinely Islamic responses to issues in the modern world. This is the kind of detailed work that many Christians want to see. So, for example, if, as Anne Elizabeth Mayer says in her Islam and Human Rights, there were three fundamental inequalities built into traditional Islamic law, between Muslims and non-Muslims, between men and women, and between free men and women and slaves, we want to know how you justify, in Islamic terms, the idea that all citizens in a modern state are equal. If all the four schools of law were unanimous for centuries over the law of apostasy, on what grounds do some Muslims argue that it can be set aside today? I am not among those who believe that Islam cannot change and develop, but I do want to understand how some very significant beliefs and practices have been put aside or adapted. The problem for many of us is that the examples of countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan don't fill us with a great deal of confidence. It must be hard for the Christians of Egypt who have heard some of the Salafis saying that if and when they get into power, they will put Christians back into the position of dhimmis. Here again, therefore, we were dealing with the battle for the soul of Islam. The new Islamists must be given time to demonstrate that they know how to run a modern state and to put bread on the table. Only then will they be able to demonstrate in what sense they can claim that Islam is the answer. Point number 10, how do we encourage dialogue at every level in our communities and throughout the world? I have no simple answer to this question, and simply hope that every one of us here this evening is totally committed to this vision and actively involved in doing things that bring Christians and Muslims face to face and heart to heart. And in conclusion, I know I've tried to cover too much ground, and there's been more of the big picture than the small detail. Is our dialogue going anywhere? Yes, I'm sure it is going somewhere in some places. But we have a very long way to go before we all stand before our Creator on the Day of Judgment. For Christians, our understanding of Jesus means that he will have a significant role on that day, and this is why St. Paul can write, all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ. As a Christian, therefore, I want to seek the mind of Christ, both as I look back over the last 100 years and as I look forward to the next.